We are back with the second episode on Mrs. Dalloway in the Backbencher's Guide to English Literature. Today, we'll discuss a few interlinked ideas that Virginia Woolf explores: space, time, characterization, and memories. By looking at her essays and fiction, we will try to find examples from texts that illustrate these points and highlight what sets her apart from authors who came before her. Woolf, as you will see, is one of those writers who also theorizes about her own writing, and she does it well. So it really gives us a lot of material to work with and a number of different angles from which we can approach these questions. I hope that the two episodes combined will also give you a sense of how to approach the novel. That is to say, what you shouldn't expect when you start to read it. You will remember that we had spoken about how the city and the ways in which it was represented, particularly in Victorian literature, was an exclusionist space dominated by men. We had discussed the concept of the male gaze, which often reduced women to objects of either pleasure or pity, rather than representing them as autonomous subjects. We attempted to read Virginia Woolf's fiction and essays as a response to this manner of writing about the city by looking at her rejection of an objective gaze that seems to know everything about a character or a situation. The example of misreading Septimus Warren Smith, one of the most significant figures in Mrs. Dalloway, served as an example. There's a little detail that struck me while rereading the passages. Have you noticed that the doctor who advises him to try and see real things is named Dr. Holmes? Do you think this is a jibe or a kind of an inside joke that Woolf cracks at the expense of the great detective and his habit of reading characters through empirical details? I suspect this could be the case, especially when I think of Woolf's opinion about Sherlock Holmes's companion, Dr. Watson, in another essay, where she says, I quote, "To me, Dr. Watson is a sack stuffed with straw, a dummy, a figure of fun." Now, I am a great fan of Sherlock Holmes, but personal preference aside, I think it's important that we remember that Virginia Woolf and Arthur Conan Doyle were writing for very different audiences. While Woolf is more critically acclaimed in literary history, there can be no doubt that many more find Sherlock Holmes much more accessible and try to look for their 221B Baker Street address when they are in London. It's a good comparison to bear in mind when we are tempted to value in absolute terms one type of literature over another. That said, I do believe there is something remarkable about what authors like Virginia Woolf or James Joyce set out to achieve through their writings. When you read their essays, and their early fiction in particular, you notice their struggles to break free from existing literary conventions. You encounter their impatience with writers who keep pretending as if the world and our ideas about it are static. As if the Great War, which took place between 1914 and 18, did not change anything fundamental to human nature. As if the suffragette movement that asserted women's right to vote or Einstein's theory of relativity had no impact upon human lives. In a rapidly changing world where painters were responding to these dramatic movements, how could writers continue to write about human subjects in the same old way? But what are the differences between the old and new modes of writing? For a few of these answers, we can turn to the essay mentioned earlier, Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, written just 1 year before Mrs. Dalloway, where Virginia Woolf set out the terms of this debate. On two opposing camps, she places the Georgians, among whom are H. G. Wells John Galsworthy, and Arnold Bennett, and the Edwardians, which includes E. M. Forster, D. H. Lawrence, T. S. Eliot, and James Joyce. In the essay, which is a delightful read, Virginia Woolf takes up a comment by Arnold Bennett, where he suggested that there is no fine novelist of the new generation, meaning Woolf's generation, because none of them have the ability to create characters who are real, true, and convincing. So, in Arnold Bennett's view, in the modern generation, that is to say the Virginia Woolfs and the T. S. Eliots and the James Joyce, there is no fine novelist because they are incapable of creating real characters in his view. So, Woolf's essay illustrates that the idea of what a literary character ought to be and how they should be represented to the reader have undergone a significant change, challenging Bennett's judgment. She writes about a train ride where she sits opposite an elderly woman and man whom she calls Mrs. Brown and Mr. Smith. In the course of the journey, she hears fragmentary conversations between them, from which it is impossible to gain a total sense of who they are. She tries to imagine this Mrs. Brown's life. Myriads of irrelevant and incongruous ideas crowd into one's head on such occasions. One sees the person. One sees Mrs. Brown in the center of all sorts of different scenes. I thought of her in a seaside house among queer ornaments, sea urchins, models of ships in glass cases. Her husband's medals were on the mantelpiece. She popped in and out of the room, perching on the edges of chairs, picking meals out of saucers, indulging in long, silent stares. She concludes by saying, I quote, "Here is Mrs. Brown, making someone begin almost automatically to write a novel about her. I believe that all novels begin with an old lady in the corner opposite." Unquote. This is a far cry from the method Bennett or Galsworthy used to create characters in Woolf's view. To start with, they would describe a house in great detail, speaking of the neighborhood, the furniture, the price of the land, and so on. A host of details from which we would have to deduce that there is a woman living in it who is a part of the story. Now, if you think about it, this is a very brave claim that Virginia Woolf is making. In her opinion, characters are not elements of a novel. This is how we as students are often asked to study them. They are not elements of a novel, but the originary impulse that drives an author to write about them. They are real people who come to life in the writer's imaginations and make a desperate bid to be released into the world through fiction. The writer must oblige, because they simply cannot contain these imagined lives within their own minds for too long. Have you ever had this feeling? It must be really exciting but scary at the same time to have this kind of, a real person evolving in your own imagination. Now that we have some sense of how character creation in modernist fiction differs from earlier periods of English literature, we can try to address the broader question of how the novel itself marks a break from established conventions. Anyone who has read Victorian novelists like Charles Dickens or Thomas Hardy cannot fail to observe a dramatic change in the manner of storytelling when it comes to Virginia Woolf. The world of Mrs. Dalloway seems at first a little difficult to enter because no one really tells us what is going on. We don't know who Clarissa Dalloway is before we learn that she wants to buy flowers herself. Nor do we know anything about Peter Walsh initially except through the fragmentary and highly subjective memories of Clarissa Dalloway. We aren't even told which city we are in or which time period until a few paragraphs into the novel, and that too not as a way of setting context but by way of describing a feeling that is a product of the place, the time of the year, and Clarissa's own personal memories. We get the sense that there is no real plot in the conventional sense of the term, no series of fortunate or unfortunate incidents which we can describe to a friend if they happen to ask what happens in the book that we are reading. I mean, what do you tell a friend if they ask you what's happening in Mrs. Dalloway? The plot, such as it is, does not change based on the reader's expectations. Like many of James Joyce's short stories, on the realizations of the characters in it, I mean, that is what drives the story and the narrative. It comes across not as a novel of events, which we are more used to, but as a novel of experience. So the obvious question that one could ask is, if not through a succession of events, what drives the narrative? The answer to that leads us to one of Woolf's great achievements, a kind of fluidity with which the narrative drifts in and out of characters' minds, visions, and memories, some of them based on their surrounding realities, some imagined, and some helplessly caught in their pasts. In European fiction, you may know that the omniscient narrator was the one who knew everything and told us the story from that position of authority. So they tell us where we are, they tell us what is going on, they tell us what the time is, and they describe the house, and they describe the characters and how they feel and what their relationships are with one another, and they basically know everything, and they have this entire world to which they are inviting us as readers. After that, some writers like Charlotte Bronte brought to life the unreliable narrator, who gives us the illusion of telling the whole story but is limited by her understanding and interpretation of events. You will notice that in both these cases, even if the narrator is unreliable, there is usually one narrative voice or point of view. This is how stories are told most commonly, even when we are narrating a set of incidents to another friend or to a family member. But when we come to Virginia Woolf or James Joyce, we find a single narrative voice disappearing. Instead, we have impressions of a particular incident or of a character given from different points of view. Taking together, they may or may not give us a comprehensive view of it. So we may not get this illusion that we know a person with every little detail of their lives. But let's try to understand this with reference to a passage from the text. We encounter Septimus Warren Smith and Rezia in a park. Now, Rezia has taken it upon herself, the very difficult role of supporting Septimus through his mental illness. Having returned from the war, as you will remember from the previous episode, Septimus keeps reliving the memories of the battlefront and frequently loses touch with his surrounding reality. A sparrow perched on the railing opposite chirped, "Septimus, Septimus," 4 or 5 times over and went on, drawing its notes out to sing freshly and piercingly in Greek words how there is no crime, and, joined by another sparrow, they sang in voices prolonged and piercing in Greek words from trees in the meadow of life beyond the river where the dead walk, how there is no death. There was his hand, there the dead. White things were assembling behind the railings opposite, but he dared not look. Evans was behind the railings. "Oh, look," she implored him. But what was there to look at? A few sheep, that was all. The way to Regent's Park Tube Station. Could they tell her the way to Regent's Park Tube Station? Macie Johnson wanted to know. She was only up from Edinburgh 2 days ago. "Not this way, over there," Rezia exclaimed, waving her aside, lest she should see Septimus. One of the things that you can keep an eye out for when you are reading Mrs. Dalloway is how people's memories function. When we encounter Clarissa's old friend Peter Walsh, who has just returned from India and is full of purpose and this idea of moving forward, quite annoying really. We are told that he does not like to dwell on the past. So the past is firmly in its place and he looks forward. Clarissa herself turns away from the present and reminisces quite frequently. And at an extreme is Septimus, who, almost clinically cannot consistently connect to his present. These ideas resonate with that of the philosopher Henri Bergson, who in 1896 had suggested that there are two types of memory. On the one hand, there are motor mechanisms, which remember past experiences and make use of that to engage with the present. On the other hand, there are what he calls memory images, of which he says, I quote, preserved in memory, reproduced in consciousness, do they not distort the practical character of life, mingling dream with reality? Unquote. So while the pragmatic utilitarian can exercise control over their past experiences to take charge of the present, those who cannot discipline their memory images are prone to drift from reality. But let's go back to the narrative, which moves on to Macie Johnson's view, whom Rezia sees on the street. Both seemed queer, Macie Johnson thought. Everything seemed queer. In London for the first time, come to take up a post at her uncle's in Leadenhall Street, and now walking through Regent's Park in the morning, this couple on the chairs gave her quite a turn. The young woman seeming foreign, the man looking queer, so that should she be very old, she would still remember and make it jangle again among her memories how she had walked through Regent's Park on a fine summer's morning 50 years ago. So what we find here is a very interesting kind of layering of memories that Macie Johnson has. Not only is she in London for the first time, her memories of Edinburgh kind of colouring the present moment, but here's a remarkable kind of incident where she actually realizes that this incident will become a memory in the future. So there is a kind of layering of that perception that takes place here. And this again, as you can see, is Macie Johnson's perception of Rezia and Septimus, which again is quite different from the interior understanding of Septimus that we have in the earlier passage. And then after a few lines, Macie Johnson herself is observed by one Mrs. Dempster. That girl, thought Mrs. Dempster, who saved crusts for the squirrels and often ate her lunch in Regent's Park, don't know a thing yet, and really it seemed to her better to be a little stout, a little slack, a little moderate in one's expectations. Percy drank. Well, better to have a son, thought Mrs. Dempster. She had had a hard time of it, and couldn't help smiling at a girl like that. You'll get married, for you're pretty enough, thought Mrs. Dempster. Get married, she thought, and then you'll know. So you see how easily Woolf succeeds in connecting these lives, who happen to catch only a fragmentary glimpse of each other. But she also points to the fact that they are prone to reading reality in terms of their own memories and their own familiar stories and relationships. The way she presents their voices is known in literary terminology as interior monologue. So when you read it, don't take this as a term that is there among literary terms, but try to understand what Woolf is doing with this interior monologue and how she is connecting multiple interior monologues to create this idea of a world of fiction. You see how each character has a different idea of themselves and how much they differ in the eyes of another person. So there are at least two different perspectives that we get on each character, one which is their own self-perception and the other which is the perception of another person. For me, this is a wonderful lesson in empathy and in acknowledging that our notions about someone else really tell us more about ourselves and our own prejudices than about the other person. it would be a very interesting kind of writing exercise to try and rewrite this scene in another style, like in the Dickensian style, where there is one omniscient narrator. This brings me to a larger point that I wanted to make, and one that will hopefully place Woolf's negotiations with character, memories, time, and place within a broader context of evolving ideas. In the early 20th century, across different art forms and fields of knowledge, people were beginning to question the ideas of static time, place, and broadly speaking, perception itself. So the idea that there is an objective reality about which we can easily write, because that objective reality is fixed and static and it's in its place and it appears the same way to everyone, is something that is being critically questioned at this point of time. In painting, one of the best examples of such thinking is found in the Cubist movement. So, led initially by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, this avant-gardist aesthetic movement claimed that painters since the European Renaissance had relied too heavily on illusionism, which is to say the idea that one had to replicate on the two-dimensional canvas the three-dimensional reality that we perceive with our senses. So the idea of perspective, where smaller, where objects that are in the distance appear smaller, objects that are close to us appear larger, of shading that gives this illusion of reality, of realism, that is something that the Cubists are beginning to question. They argued that an artist's vision could convey the idea of an object or of a scene or a person better through different means, such as by showing it not from one but from multiple perspectives. Different perspectives projected onto a two-dimensional surface broke up this reality into geometric forms and glass-like shards. It is no surprise then that when Woolf thought of writing a biography of her friend, the painter Roger Fry, she initially planned to have it written by several different people who were close to him. So, in a sense, this would replicate the Cubist technique of painting portraits by drawing a character from multiple perspectives. One of my favorite illustrations of this idea of multiple visions is this painting by Gino Severini, which quite brilliantly shows the train both from the outside and from, the many sights that we see in quick succession from inside the train. So we don't see one constant reality outside the train, but it's a constantly changing reality that we see, right? And that is what Severini has done in these kind of geometric shapes, split up the reality that we see over a particular duration into these fragments. This idea of seeing different things from the same point of view must also have struck a chord with Virginia Woolf, who alludes to the train metaphor several times in her works. A significant portion of the essay, Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, takes place in a train, and in her later novel, The Waves, 1931, Woolf introduces characters through the differences in their perceptions from train windows. So they are all kind of moving towards the city, and they see different things to the train, but they respond in very different ways. So that tells you about the characters. By now it should be clear that the idea of perception, both in terms of human characters and space, had been fractured by philosophers, writers, and painters in the early 20th century. They saw it not as one objective whole, but as relative to the observer or observers. Let us conclude by turning to one of the most powerful concepts to emerge during this period, which is Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, which claimed that even time was not objective. Its perception could not only change from person to person depending on their position, but was dependent on the speed of light itself. It is no surprise that even Einstein's famous theory, which Virginia Woolf was well aware of, by the way, especially through her friend Bertrand Russell, is also illustrated in terms of two passengers on a railway carriage. So Einstein says that there are two passengers who observe two simultaneous flashes of lightning, but believe them to have taken place at two different points of time depending on which direction they are moving in and how close they are to the flash of lightning. It sometimes makes me wonder how deeply philosophical, literary, artistic, and scientific realizations may be dependent upon technological changes, such as the invention and popularity of railways, such as the invention of clocks, so on and forth. So, could these thoughts have appeared in a pre-industrial period? Perhaps they could have, but it also makes us think of how closely these factors are kind of interlinked. And so with that, I'd like to close this two-part series on Virginia Woolf. We have traveled on foot and we have traveled by rail in order to understand clearly how in her fiction time, space, memories and characters are written about. I have tried to make the text a little more relatable in terms of ideas, but also to give you a sense of how different it is when compared to the realist fiction of the late 19th or early 20th centuries. If you have any questions or comments, agreements, disagreements, please feel free to write to me at the email address given below. I would be more than happy to discuss this and any of her other writings with you. Thank you.